Good morning and welcome to The Art of Composition. Thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it. I thought I would take a look at Mark Power and some of his images. He is a Magnum photographer, and I came across his work in the video The Art of Street Photography. And I've talked about the video in the past. It's a great video for those that are interested in street photography. It's $99. I highly recommend it. And I've watched it, I can't even tell you how many times. A lot. And it's interesting because it's nice to see some good videos on street photography. Street photography took this weird turn maybe 6 or 7 years ago with all the blogging and all the 10 things I learned from Alex Webb and 10 things I learned from Constantine Menace and all that weird stuff. Street photography was sort of going down the drain with all that mass marketing and YouTube and Googling crap. But now you're starting to see more videos by master photographers like Annie Leibovitz and Magnum, and these videos are really high quality. And it's great to see photographers with real experience coming out and doing some actual training videos. So it's worth mentioning, but I thought I would just poke around a little bit at Mark's work. Mark does a lot of landscape, and sometimes he has people in his landscapes and sometimes he doesn't. But usually if he has people in his landscapes, there's such a small element, you almost miss them. And you sort of have to look really closely to find them. So it's just worth mentioning. But one thing I will say about his work, it's clean. And what I mean by clean is the image quality is outstanding and they're not visually cluttered. And in my own work, that's something that I look for. I try to avoid visual clutter because when it comes to street photography, it's sort of something that I see a lot of where the photographer doesn't understand design, so their images tend to clump together, all the elements clump together. So, all right. I haven't really looked through his body of work. And like I said, I only came across who he was in the video, The Art of Street Photography. But, again, he has a massive body of work. And something as simple as this, all your figures are separated clearly. They're not huge. They don't fill up the frame. But the figures, they don't have to fill up the frame. And Harry Guyart is the same way in a lot of his landscapes. The figure is quite small in comparison to the overall frame. But you can create a phenomenal photograph using this technique. And I use it a lot now. I don't buy into this, your images aren't good enough if you're not close enough. And that's a Robert Capa quote. And with most photography quotes, they don't really mean anything because they're not based on art. They're based on emotions and, the romantic stuff, which is fine. But if you want to be a artistic photographer, you have to be able to separate out the two and understand the difference between the two. This is great. Even though this vertical line is slightly slanted, it's balanced out by this horizontal line here. And the figure in the window, great figure-ground relationship, stands out. Good gesture. Creates, you have a strong horizontal line here with the arms outstretched. So it's mimicking the top of the window and the bottom, the frame of the window. So when you're photographing and you're seeing elements like this, I recommend doing a series of images because depending on the figure and how it's posed, it changes the entire composition, even as something as small as this. Because if this figure was just standing there with their arms at their side, it would have a completely different visual impact. And he might have taken a series, I can't say for sure. I haven't looked at his contact sheets, but most photographers in Magnum do. The same thing here. You have two figures here, and they're enclosed in this elliptical, this circle. It's basically a circle, but it's flattened out, so visually it looks like an ellipse. But they're enclosed by it. And then you have this path. Looks like they dragged a cart. Your eye comes in here and it moves around in this fashion. So you have an entry point, and Henry Rankin Poor talks about that in Pictorial Composition, an introduction. I believe it's right at the end of the book. He calls about it. There's a chapter where he talks about entering a composition and exiting a composition. I'm pretty sure it's at the end of the book, but I'm not 100% sure. But anyway, your eye moves in here to this cart, and then it moves around, and it looks like this guy's taking a photograph. He's leaning over, which brings you into here. So you're coming in here, moving around, and then back to here. So the focal point is right here in the photograph. Because of the gazing direction of this guy here, he's looking down, and you also have the path leading in and then circles around. When you're photographing, there's a lot to think about when you're photographing, but if you're aware of some of these techniques that photographers use, it really will improve your body of work. Martine Frank talks about it, about the art of composition and the art of photography, and it's a recognition that comes with art training. And this is why I do a lot of videos on other photographers, because I'm trying to teach the photographer how to improve what they're doing and learn how to see things that they might not have thought of before. I have a cup of coffee with me today, but I'll pause when I take a swig. This is interesting. This looks like something from the 60s, even though it was photographed in 1999. But again, you have all your figures that are clearly separated out. You really have to be careful of clumping of images. And I was looking on a photographer's website this morning, a very popular photography website, and I was looking at their body of work. And one thing I noticed with all their figures in their candid street stuff, they all clump together. And Manos talked about this in the workshop that I took with him. You really have to, when you're photographing, you have to look at how all your figures and elements are relating to one another. And you're not going to be able to see everything at once, but you learn how to tune out what's more important in a photograph. This is a great shot. The subject is framed in the doorway, and you're going to see this a lot in this type of work. You can use archways and elements that surround your subject to box them in, frame them in. But her position is it's at an angle. Her legs are slightly at an angle, and it's repeating the stairs. But the fact that she has her head tilted back also reinforces an upward motion. And you're repeating the idea of an upward motion here with the stairs. And again, I'm not trying to overanalyze something, but as you're photographing and you're bringing your images back to Lightroom, it will help you to narrow down out of a series which might be the strongest photograph. And there's a lot to composition. It's just not about everything lining up on lines, on grids. There has to be an emotional aspect to it, and I see this a lot with those that get into dynamic symmetry. They get too fixated on lining elements up, and they're not really thinking about what they're photographing. So they can bring back a photograph that looks compositionally good because it lines up on some particular grid, but the photograph is boring because it doesn't say anything. And in Mikhail Jacobs' book, he talks about that. The idea has to come first. The design only reinforces the idea, not the other way around. I love this photograph. You have 4 subjects. I love the angle, looking down. All these 3 are looking at the photographer, and yet the woman's got her face down. And this is what, for me, makes the picture. If she was looking at the camera like everybody else, it wouldn't have the same impact. And you do have movement around here. But like I said, the fact that she is turned face down when the others are looking at the camera, it really creates tension. And it wouldn't have the same impact if she was flipped around looking at the camera. Clean edges. The first thing I look for when I'm looking at a photograph is the edge, and then I work inward. And that's a good technique when you're actually photographing. I love photographs like this. Simple arrangement, good figure-ground relationship, nothing overwhelming but beautifully composed. Great moment. I gravitate more towards this type of photography as I've gotten older. Maybe that's just because when you reach a certain age, you want to simplify things. And I feel that way visually. But I believe Konstantin Manos said the same thing in the workshop that I took. He said, you want to keep things visually simple. Too much clutter is not a good thing. And the same thing here. You have the diagonal line in the arm here mimicking these diagonal lines in the clouds. You have one here, here, and then the arm reinforces that. So you're creating a gamut. You're creating a limited number of directions, and it creates a rhythm. It creates a visual rhythm. And the fact that he's bent over like this mimics the bars that he's hanging on to. You have this arch here, and you're repeating this arch here. Again, these are the things that you want to be aware of when you're evaluating your own work. Another simple scene here. It's interesting, you have this dominant horizontal line here, but you have the diagonal line of the man, and it creates tension. Beautiful. Dark subject, lighter background. Simple arrangement, but not... When I say simple arrangement, I'm not saying it's simple to get these photographs, because it's not. It's incredibly hard. One thing about photography is, and I read this in the book, The Essence of Photography, Bruce Barnbaum states that photography can be deceiving because it looks so easy. All you're doing is pressing a button. But creating great images is incredibly difficult, and it requires years of knowledge and experience. And when I wrote my user's guide, I wanted to bring all those techniques together, not so that the photographer can learn them all at once. They're never going to learn them all at once. You just have to bite off a little bit at a time, and you learn as you go. And I just want to poke around here. Mark does a lot of photographs like this. He does a lot of landscapes. But again, when I was saying the subjects are so small, they're right here. If you're not careful, you wouldn't even see them. But yet, it's an effective photograph. They don't have to be massive they don't have to fill the frame. There's rules in photography, and you should learn the rules. I have talked about this a little bit in the past. Photographers seem to be afraid of rules, and I'm not going to mince words and call them something else, because other photographers do that when they're teaching. They avoid the word rule, but you know what? You're not avoiding the problem. The problem is you have to understand these techniques, and there are rules to composition. And if you don't understand them, you can't break them. So when photographers come back and go, I'm not going to learn them because all I would do is break them anyway, that's not really a valid point. It doesn't make any sense, because you can't break what you don't know. And I'm going to call them rules because that's what they are. You know, you can call them whatever you want, but it doesn't change the fact that you have to understand what you're doing. Tiny figure. But again, you have this curvilinear element that it encloses the figure, and the eye moves in this direction and around. Comes around here. You can learn more about that. It's called the arabesque. This is dramatic, very dramatic, beautiful photograph. Your dominant vertical, your dominant horizontal, and your dominant diagonal line is right here. Generally speaking, in a good work of art, you have three dominant lines: vertical, horizontal, and diagonal. Not every work of art is going to have that, but in general terms, that's usually the case. And like I said, you have your vertical here, horizontal, and then your diagonal line. And the diagonal lines being repeated here and here. And here. I'm not sure how many of these I'm going to look at. Like I said, I haven't looked through here. Great photograph. Love it. This is something that I would photograph. And you don't need people to have an effective photograph. Photographers, what's great about photography is you can bounce around. You're not going to the canvas, you don't have one idea. You can shoot a landscape, you can shoot a street image, and then you can go back to landscape again, all on the same time period. And that's what I love about photography. And that's why I'm pushing back on those photographers that are teaching the art of photography in the same way the artist does when they go to the canvas. That's not a good approach, because photography is not drawing and painting, and you can't teach it that way. You have to embrace the tool that you're using. And you don't have to like every image by a photographer. When I go through these, I don't like every image that I see. I sort of pull out the ones that have visual power when I'm looking at them in a thumbnail. For example, like this. Very, very powerful image. Whereas this one for me, it's not that I don't like it, but it doesn't stand out like this one. It doesn't grab my eye right away. And I'm not saying it's not a good photograph. I'm not saying that at all. But I just figured if I'm going to take a look at their work, I would photograph this. I love colorful things and things that stand out. William Eggleston was good with this. He would find landscapes that really kind of popped out, that looked either unusual, the colors were strong, or something that was quirky. Mark Power is a little bit more straightforward, but he sort of has some of those elements that Eggleston has. Again, here, same thing. Not even sure what these are, but great photograph. You have to be a good photographer to take a photograph of something like this and make it look good. This is where design really comes in. You can take the most mundane subject matter and make it a work of art. And that really is all about design. Because let's face it, most people wouldn't photograph this. Or even this, for that matter. But if you understand design, that's what I mean when I say it's hard to be creative when you don't understand design. Because when you understand design, you see everything through a different lens. When I was photographing when I was younger, I definitely did not see a lot of things, and I made a lot of mistakes. And I look through some of my images and I think, wow, this would have been a great shot if I only done this, if I only knew that. But now that I know, when I photograph something similar or whatever I'm photographing, I have an awareness that I just did not have before. And that comes in time, and that comes with the right knowledge. Not just knowledge, because there's so much shit out there right now on the internet. I've talked about some of the more popular websites. They don't teach you anything. And that's just being honest. I'm not critiquing somebody else's website, but you have to look at this stuff logically too. You have to say, am I really learning anything here? Or am I just being entertained? And there's nothing wrong with entertainment, but if you want to be a good photographer, you have to learn too. And same thing here. This is great. Framing in the subject in the doorway. Basic setup, nothing like too dramatic, but it's a great photograph because you have the colorful background and it's sort of creating a surreal effect. I'll just take a look at a few more. Great photograph. Dominant vertical. I would say the dominant horizontal line is here. And this doesn't really appear to have a strong diagonal line. Like I said, not every work of art is going to have that criteria, but it is something to be aware of. Great photo. Good figure ground relationship. A nice balance in the elements. You have an element here, and then you have this strong color here against the brick. If you put your thumb over this area, you'll see how it's balanced out. If she was around here, it wouldn't work. The fact that she's further to the left balances out this strong contrasting color. Simple arrangement, but not so simple. You have to understand balance. And that's why I keep mentioning Rankin Poor's book. You know, $10 can open up your world. That's going to be it for today. I'm going to cut it here. I usually try to make these around 20 minutes, not to overwhelm the viewer. But thanks for joining me. I appreciate it, as always.